Milo Rossi is an amateur archaeologist, environmental scientist, and author with a well-deserved following of 2 million subscribers on YouTube as of the time of finalizing this script, the 17th of December 2024. I've been a subscriber to his channel for well over a year and always enjoyed his exceptional level of detail, strong academic grounding, explicit use of scholarly sources, which he cites frequently and lists in his video description, and commitment to intellectual honesty. He's not perfect, and he sometimes makes mistakes, but he's in regular communication with professional archaeologists, which helps keep him well informed, and he is open to correction. His channel, Miniminuteman, is a great resource for learning about history and archaeology. In a video on the 3rd of June this year, entitled Philippe Zeber Debunked, TikTok's Worst Conspiracy Theorist, Part 2, Milo commented on the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, saying, quote, "But it also wasn't built with slaves. I've made this mistake before," end quote, and adding, quote, "The Great Pyramid was built by, like, craftsmen and laborers. It was not an enslaved force," end quote. Milo has a Bachelor of Environmental Science with a minor in archaeology. He knows what he's talking about on these subjects, and he continues to educate himself by reading relevant academic literature. However, in this particular case, I believe he's wrong. In my view, Milo's statement, "it was not an enslaved force," requires correction. Now, I do not intend to discredit Milo. Scholarship has gone back and forth on this topic over the years, and even current scholarship isn't entirely united, so it isn't at all easy to determine the facts simply by reading a few scholarly journal articles or books. I've been working on this script for around 6 months and have found it very difficult to synthesize the relevant primary sources and determine which secondary sources are the most authoritative. I certainly don't blame Milo for repeating what can be found in standard academic commentary. On the 20th of June 2024, I sent him an email letting him know I was writing the script for this video and advising him of some of my sources, but given the volume of email he receives regularly, he probably never saw it. However, when I tagged him on YouTube recently announcing this video, he responded very graciously, writing, quote, "Looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I've touched on this topic a few times, but never delved too deep into it, so I'm interested in hearing a more in-depth analysis. Can't wait," end quote. To save you time, here's where I think he's wrong. Although a minority of the labour force consisted of skilled craftsmen, most of those who worked on the Great Pyramid, as well as other pyramids and monumental structures, were not skilled craftsmen and were an enslaved labour force consisting of coerced free citizens, convicts, and captured foreign prisoners of war. They were not respected, their labour was obtained under threat of violence, they were punished for refusing to participate or attempting to leave the worksite, they had no protection from arbitrary physical abuse resulting in injury or death, they were unpaid, and they were sometimes not even fed for days at a time. If that's all you came for, feel free to click out now. If you want to hear my arguments and evidence in the shortest amount of time, use the timestamps in the video description to jump to the section, "The Great Pyramid Used Slave Labour." If you want to hear everything, keep listening for a deep dive into the primary textual and archaeological sources and relevant scholarly literature. This is long. I don't have a background in archaeology, but I do have a Bachelor of Arts with a classics major, so although I didn't study archaeology, I am very familiar with certain periods of archaic and classical history. I know where to find the relevant primary sources for this particular subject, and I am familiar with the academic debate over it. I've also been a university research assistant, and I have a few scholarly journal articles and presentations to my name, so I do have some experience with the academy. Please note that throughout this video, I'll be using academic translations of ancient Egyptian terminology rather than pronouncing the Egyptian terms myself, since I have no confidence in my ability to pronounce them correctly. When I am quoting these terms from scholarly literature, the terms will be visible on screen in the quotations using academic English transliteration. What do we really mean by slavery? When Milo says the Great Pyramid workers were, quote, "not an enslaved force," end quote, he's very likely talking about chattel slavery, a very specific form of slavery typically associated with the ancient world and which was preserved in many places afterwards, most infamously in the United States. Although the precise definition of chattel slavery has been a matter of scholarly debate for decades, there is a general consensus on a cluster of common features. Here's a definition from Suzanne Mears, Professor Emeritus of African History at Ohio University. Quote, "A chattel slave is normally defined as someone under the complete domination of an owner who has powers of life and death over him or her, can sell and transfer him at will, and has full control over his daily and domestic life, including his progeny. Moreover, his status is hereditary." End quote. Now, that might seem very straightforward, but the issue is that even though these are typical elements of chattel slavery, all of them can also be elements of other forms of slavery to a greater or lesser extent. You could have a person whose life experienced all of these restrictions in only a very slightly modified way, to the extent that although you wouldn't technically call them a chattel slave, they would still qualify as an enslaved labourer. This was particularly the case in the ancient world, in which many people lived within quite a narrow spectrum of freedom, where the difference in degrees between free, semi-free, and enslaved was very often slight, and someone's position along that spectrum could easily change very suddenly for reasons totally beyond their control. Were the vast majority of pyramid and other monumental structure workers chattel slaves? Definitely not in the typical sense of privately owned and heritable property coerced and controlled arbitrarily in the manner described in the definition I gave. So if Milo wants to qualify his original statement by saying something like they were not a workforce of chattel slaves, I could agree with him that this is technically true. However, as I've explained, I think even this is only true in such a narrow technical sense that it really doesn't justify the blanket statement that they were not an enslaved force. It's a distinction without a difference. This is not just a matter of playing with words. In the next section, I'll argue that most of this workforce certainly was enslaved in a way I think Milo would actually agree with. I'll spend some time defining divisions of labour in ancient Egypt and identify the precise kind of slave labour under which almost all pyramid and monumental structure labourers lived. If you'd like to hear about that now, use the timestamps in the video description to skip ahead to the section entitled Understanding Unfree Labour in Ancient Egypt. Alternatively, you can stay for the rest of this section. Now I'll discuss so-called modern slavery, which I think is relevant because it's a form of coerced labour which definitely isn't chattel slavery, but which is still literally slavery. This is another reason why I think it's wrong to say the pyramid and other monumental labourers weren't an enslaved force. There's a reason why modern slavery is called modern. It isn't just because it's the form of slavery which has become most prevalent in the modern era, it's also because it isn't exactly the same as chattel slavery. People labouring under modern slavery aren't chattel slaves according to the regular academic definitions. Nevertheless, they are indisputably enslaved labourers, and the distinction between their specific form of slavery and that of chattel slavery is typically vanishingly small. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's worth raising this point. I don't like the idea of the individual words slave and slavery being defined so narrowly that they only refer to chattel slavery, since doing so has the effect of excluding forms of modern labour relations which really are slavery. Taking them out of that category makes them a lot easier to justify, which I think has serious ethical implications, and I believe Milo would agree with this. It's certainly a fact that international organisations and many governments define various forms of coerced labour as slavery, even if they don't qualify specifically as chattel slavery. For example, Anti-Slavery International states, quote, "We define modern slavery as when an individual is exploited by others for personal or commercial gain. Whether tricked, coerced, or forced, they lose their freedom. This includes, but is not limited to, human trafficking, forced labour, and debt bondage." End quote. That's a definition which doesn't exactly match typical academic definitions of chattel slavery, but does match the conditions of most of the pyramid labourers. Here's a definition of slavery from the government of the United Kingdom. Quote, "For the purposes of Part 5 of the 2022 Act, victim of slavery means a person who has been subjected to slavery, servitude, or forced or compulsory labour." End quote. Again, that's a definition which doesn't exactly match typical academic definitions of chattel slavery, but does match the conditions of most of the pyramid labourers. Now here's a definition of modern slavery from the United States Department of State. Quote, Forced labour, sometimes also referred to as labour trafficking, encompasses the range of activities recruiting, harbouring, transporting, providing, or obtaining involved when a person uses force or physical threats, psychological coercion, abuse of the legal process, deception, or other coercive means to compel someone to work. Once a person's labour is exploited by such means, the person's prior consent to work for an employer is legally irrelevant. The employer is a trafficker and the employee a trafficking victim. End quote. Note that this definition of slavery is unaffected even if the labourer gives their consent. Consequently, this can potentially apply even to circumstances in which labour is volunteered while in a coercive environment, such as prison labour. And yes, when prisoners in the US are coerced into or even volunteer for labour without pay or virtually no pay, it is explicitly justified by appeal to the 13th Constitutional Amendment, which states the imposition of slavery is still legal, quote, as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, end quote. When people justify US prison labour by appealing to that amendment, they are saying they believe US prison labour, even voluntary and paid, is slave labour. Consequently, as many commentators have observed, US prison labour is legitimately described as slavery insofar as it is coerced. It is true, some prison labour is paid for, such as certain forms of manufacturing. Some prison labour is even volunteered for and paid for, such as when prisoners volunteer for firefighting duties for which they are trained and for which they receive money. But whenever the labour is a product of coercion, this is slavery whether or not it is paid for or volunteered for. A captive workforce is being compelled directly or indirectly to perform work for another party on the basis of the power unilaterally exercised against them. A comparison of the conditions of chattel slavery to those of modern slavery shows there is very little functional difference between them. In both cases, labourers cannot liberate themselves unilaterally. Labourers' freedom of movement is controlled unilaterally. Labourers are in a subordinate power relationship they cannot change unilaterally. Labour is coerced, and consent is irrelevant to whether the person is defined as a slave. Labourers are vulnerable to arbitrary punishment, mental, emotional, physical, or financial. It's true there are some important distinctions to be made. Chattel slaves are property, modern slaves are not. Chattel slavery was typically permanent, modern slavery is typically not. The children of chattel slaves are legally also slaves. The children of modern slaves are not. Chattel slaves typically had no legal protection from arbitrary violence from their masters. Modern slaves typically have at least some, though these laws may not be enforced consistently or even at all. These are legitimate technical distinctions between chattel slavery and modern slavery. However, regardless of these differences on paper, in practice, modern slaves are often treated as chattel slaves. I think the pyramid labourers qualify as an enslaved workforce as defined by modern slavery and by academic definitions of enslavement. Milo's claim has support in scholarship. If you search online and read pop history books, even some academic history books, you'll find plenty of sources saying pretty much what Milo has already told us, though they sometimes add a few interesting qualifications. For example, we find Milo supported by the book Groundbreaking Scientific Experiments, Inventions, and Discoveries of the Ancient World, published in 2003 by Bloomsbury, a high-quality trade publication house. The authors cite, quote, a common misconception that the pyramids were built entirely by slave labour, end quote, which sounds like just what Milo has said. However, they add, quote, while the peasants and farmers were unpaid for their labours, they were not slaves, although, in this case, it may really be a distinction without a difference, end quote. They don't cite any primary sources or scholarly literature, and although this point they've raised is very important, unfortunately they don't develop it further. But we'll return to this issue later. Note, however, that the authors of this book, Robert and Carolyn Krebs, are not specialists in this field. We also find Milo supported by Jan Assmann, a professional Egyptologist of great repute, whose book, The Mind of Egypt, History and Meaning in the Time of the Pharaohs, was most recently published in 2003 by Harvard University Press, a respectable academic press. Assmann writes, quote, it is completely erroneous to speak of slave labour in the true sense of that term, end quote, adding, quote, The pyramids were built by labourers who, while they had no choice in the matter, were at least paid for their work. End quote. So, while denying they were slaves in the true sense of the term, by which he probably means chattel slaves, he does note they had no choice, a degree of coercion he compares to military conscription in time of war, which he says, quote, also represents a combination of compulsory service and a high degree of identification, end quote. Unfortunately, this section of Assmann's work doesn't include references to any primary sources or citations of any secondary literature, so we're left wondering how he reached this conclusion, but let's just note that comparison he has made to conscription, since it's an acknowledgement of some degree of coercion in the labour relationship. It should also be noted that this is a 2003 edition of a work originally published in 1997, so we should see what more up-to-date specialist sources have to say. Now let's look at Science and Technology in World History, an introduction, published in 2006 by Johns Hopkins University Press, another respectable academic press, which says, quote, contrary to a once common belief, forced slave labour did not build the pyramids, but labour was conscripted like military conscription today and organised in work gangs. Workers received food supplied by state granaries, and the completed pyramids served as tombs for departed pharaohs, end quote. This sounds very promising, but again we see a tension between the claim that the labour force was not enslaved with the acknowledgement that they were conscripted, meaning their labour was non-voluntary. Once again, we're left with no information on the degree of distinction being drawn between these two situations, since unfortunately there are no references to primary sources or citations of scholarly literature. Well, this was published nearly 20 years ago, so perhaps we should look at an even more recent work. Mesopotamian scholar Piotr Steinkeller's conference paper, Corvée Labour in Three Times, presented in 2010 and later published by the highly respected academic press Eisenbrauns, says the same as our previous source. Steinkeller writes, quote, contrary to the common belief, which goes back to Herodotus, who thought that the pyramids were built by an army of slaves numbering 100,000 individuals, these labourers were well treated and amply fed, end quote. Adding, quote, as shown by the great quantities of cattle, sheep, and goat bones that were excavated there, their diet included significant quantities of meat, end quote. Although Steinkeller isn't an Egyptologist, he is a specialist in Mesopotamian history, and unlike our previous source, he actually provides 4 citations in support of his claim. However, his sources are of mixed quality. The first is a National Geographic article from 2001 by Virginia Morrill, a science writer. Morrill is not a specialist, this is not an academic work, and it's over 20 years old now. The second is a scholarly journal article from 2002 by Mark Lerner, an archaeologist specializing in Egypt. Although that's still just over 20 years old, it's by a relevant specialist and it is a scholarly work, so it's worth investigating. The third is a 2002 reprint of the 1997 work by Assmann, and we've already looked at that. The fourth is a 2003 article by Jonathan Shaw, editor of the Harvard magazine, which is at least an academic publication. However, this is simply an article on Mark Lerner's work, and since it just cites Lerner, it's not an independent source. This is not a very solid collection of evidence for Steinkeller's claim. First, let's see what Shaw's article says about Lerner's scholarly paper. Shaw writes, quote, there were slaves in Egypt, says Lerner, but the discovery that pyramid workers were fed like royalty buttresses other evidence that they were not slaves at all, at least in the modern sense of the word, end quote. That does sound like solid archaeological evidence, despite the significant qualification, at least in the modern sense of the word. Later, we'll return to that claim about workers being fed like royalty and examine it in detail with some of Lerner's more recent work. Now let's look directly at Lerner's actual scholarly paper published in 2002. Interestingly, it doesn't contain any reference to slaves. Very notably, it doesn't contain any statement that the pyramid workforce cannot have been slaves because they ate well. However, it certainly contains references to evidence that workers on the Great Pyramid enjoyed a meat-rich diet. Lerner writes, quote, cattle, sheep, and goat remains are particularly abundant. Richard Redding estimates that 11 cattle and 30 sheep or goat were slaughtered per day, enough for several thousand to have eaten meat every day over a period exceeding 3 generations. The evidence suggests large-scale consumption, end quote. Scholars often express themselves more cautiously in their academic articles than in their public statements or in non-academic publications, and we do have Shaw's article indicating that Lerner's personal interpretation of this evidence for meat consumption is that the workers fed by these supplies were not slaves. Later in this article, he writes, quote, "Building for the royal house on the scale of the early giant pyramids must have certainly been the kind of obligatory labor so well attested for ancient Egypt," end quote. The term obligatory labor is a reference to the compulsory labor we've seen mentioned previously by other sources, some of whom have acknowledged this was coerced labor. However, at least in this article, Lerner seems to differentiate this compulsory labor from slavery. This still leaves Steinkeller's claim that the Great Pyramid builders were not slaves and were in fact, quote, "well treated and amply fed," end quote, which is only supported by one of his sources, Lerner. However, a book chapter by Lerner himself in the 2015 scholarly publication Labor in the Ancient World presents a distinctly different view to his earlier 2002 article. In this 2015 book chapter, Lerner states, quote, "The idea that captive foreigners worked on the early pyramids has been cited in terms of evidence lacking for a systematic out-of-district corvée of the native population. A review, and evidence already cited in section 3.2, suggests both captive and conscripted labor built the pyramids," end quote. Whatever we might think of the terms captive and conscripted labor, it is clear that this is already a much more nuanced statement than the previous declaration that the Great Pyramid workforce did not use slaves. In fact, the term captive labor certainly sounds a lot like slaves. We'll return to Lerner's 2015 paper later. If you want to skip ahead to that, use the timestamps in the video description to jump to the section "The Great Pyramid Used Slave Labor." Let's continue looking at more recent scholarly sources on this topic. Here's a quotation from anthropologist John Rutherford's book, 50 Great Myths of Human Evolution, Understanding Misconceptions About Our Origins. Quote, "Contrary to Hollywood productions, the pyramids were not built primarily with slave labor, but by skilled artisans dedicated to ensuring the journey of their rulers to the afterlife," end quote. This was published in 2017, so it's current literature, and it was published by Wiley Blackwell, also a respectable academic press. This is sounding good. Are there any citations of primary or secondary sources for this claim? Unfortunately not. Rutherford gives us a citation for his previous statement about the historical development of the pyramids, and gives us a citation for a later statement about construction methods, but in the section in which he denies the pyramids were built with slave labor, he doesn't cite any sources, so we're left a little uncertain of what this conclusion was based on. However, we still haven't looked at any specialist literature later than Lerner's work in 2015, so let's do that now. When we do, we find there's a lot more debate on this topic among scholars than Milo's confident and definitive statements would have us believe. To finish this section, I'll list 4 criteria by which you could assess whether or not you are a slave. 1. Your labor is coerced. 2. You have no freedom of liberty. 3. You are vulnerable to arbitrary punishment. 4. You are unable to change this relationship unilaterally. If all of these criteria apply to you simultaneously, would you say you are free, a slave, or something in between? Let's look at them in detail. 1. Labor by coercion. If your labor is being coerced, you might be a slave. Even if your labor is being compensated with food or money, you can still be a slave. Plantation slaves in North America were provided with accommodation, food, and clothing, but they were still slaves. 2. Loss of liberty. If you are not free to leave the worksite, and you are locked up in secure accommodation when you are not on the worksite, and there are guards preventing you leaving, and there are severe punishments for attempting to leave, you might be a slave. Again, this applies to North American plantation slaves, but it also applies to many people in modern slavery who are kept in secured accommodation which they are unable to leave. 3. Vulnerability to arbitrary punishment. If you can be punished arbitrarily, whether mentally, emotionally, physically, or financially, without recourse to justice, you might be a slave. This vulnerability to arbitrary punishment is an essential element of the coercion which extracts your labor. 4. Lack of ability to change the relationship. If you are in a relationship of coerced labor, which has been unilaterally imposed on you, and you are unable to change that relationship independently, you're likely to be a slave. By both ancient and modern definitions, if all four of these criteria apply to you, then you are a slave. Current scholarly views on pyramid worker slavery. Kaf Dola is a professor of economics with a range of specializations, including ancient and modern slavery. In his 2020 journal article, Cross-Border Labor Mobility, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives, he provides extremely useful commentary on the topic under discussion, mainly because he cites the actual state of the issue as it is viewed among relevant scholars. He writes, quote, "Although increasingly being challenged, it is widely believed that the building of mammoth monuments, like the pyramids, might have involved the employment of extensive slave labor," end quote. And most importantly, he later adds, quote, "Controversy surrounding the issue remains unresolved," end quote. So despite the firm statements we've already seen from academic sources, though even most of those included some form of qualification, it's clear that the closer we get to the issue as it is discussed by specialists more related to the topic, the more nuance we find. According to Dola, the issue still hasn't been resolved by the relevant specialists in the field, which is a challenge to Milo's claim. We've also seen that the view that the pyramids were built by slaves is widely believed, according to Dola. We see clear evidence that Dola is correct in a 2023 article entitled Ancient Egyptian Slavery by Dr. Ella Karev, an Egyptologist who specializes in enslavement and bonded labor. In this section, she speaks of corvée labor, a kind of labor which was compulsory for certain classes of free citizen and which was extracted from them on demand by the pharaoh as a kind of taxation. This is the kind of labor which was used to build the pyramids and other monumental structures. Karev writes, quote, "Although taxation levied in the form of labor was a reason for entering a possibly coerced labor force in Egypt, this does not necessarily mean that this labor could be defined as enslavement in modern terminology," end quote. Karev's very carefully chosen language indicates there is still some debate on the topic in the field, even now. Again, it's interesting to see how this statement on the subject from a modern specialist is much more nuanced than the stronger and more absolute statements we've seen previously. Karev adds, quote, "The aforementioned ambiguity of terminology means that it is difficult to tell whether the people performing this labor were coerced into doing so or not," end quote. So as we've seen hinted at previously, pinning down precise terminology on this issue is quite difficult, and the classification of slave and non-slave depends to a certain extent on a fairly subjective application of definitions and criteria. We'll return to Karev's article when we look at corvée labor in more detail later, since she provides many citations from primary and secondary sources. Meanwhile, Dola's article provides citations explaining why there is some controversy over whether the pyramid building workforce was enslaved, writing, quote, "Recent archaeological discoveries found some tombs of workers who were thought to have built the pyramids positioned next to the pyramids. If workers were slaves, they would not have been buried next to powerful pharaohs. The findings also suggested that workers were well fed and well treated, also suggesting that workers might not have been slaves," end quote. However, we must proceed with caution since the sources cited by Dola are two news articles from the 11th and 12th of January 2010, both reporting the same information. These are not scholarly sources, and they are 10 years earlier than Dola's own article. We'll examine the source of the information in these articles later. So now let's go to another recently published specialist source, which also demonstrates that the question of the pyramids being built with slave or free labor is in fact much more open than the statements we've seen from Milo and various other sources. In a 2020 article entitled Forced Labor and Deportations in Ancient Egypt, Recent Trends and Future Possibilities, Egyptologist Christian Langer, who specializes in the socioeconomics of ancient Egypt, writes, quote, "The extent of the deportation policies and the impact of unfree labor on the Egyptian and adjacent societies were grossly underestimated by previous scholars," end quote, adding, quote, "Such results may engender a more realistic, nuanced perspective on the existence and weight of slavery and unfree labor generally in Egyptian society," end quote. This is already enough reason to reconsider the bolder statements we've read previously about the pyramids not being built with slave labor. Most importantly for the issue at hand, Langer objects to what he describes as, quote, "grandiose statements such as the pyramids were built by slaves or there was no slavery in Egypt, all workers were free," both extremes of which get touted by both amateurs and specialists in popular science, including social media." End quote. Again, we find that the more we read the most recent scholarly literature by those specialists working most closely to the topic, the more we find not only increasingly nuanced commentary on the topic of unfree labor used for the pyramids, but even a rejection of the previous scholarly claims that pyramid workers were free artisans and laborers who were compensated well for their work. We'll return to Langer in the next section when we look at labor in ancient Egypt. Let's now return to Milo's comments on the scale of work required to build the pyramids, which is relevant to the topic at hand. Milo states, quote, "As far as I know, there's no actual, Egyptologist consensus on how long it took to build the Great Pyramid. And personally, I feel like 20 years is a little fast. I am not an Egyptologist, so I'm not going to speak as an authority figure on it like some of us are." End quote. This is a typically modest comment from Milo, and I'm going to support it with a quotation from Dola, who I cited earlier. Dola writes, quote, "Available literature suggests it took 10,000 workers more than 30 years to build just one single pyramid." End quote. So Milo's view of the scale of work is actually very much in agreement with available literature. However, when we think of 10,000 workers involved in the building of the pyramid, it should become clear that it is incredibly unlikely all 10,000 of them were specialized artisans, skilled, well-respected, well-paid, and well-fed. There was certainly a need for specialized work, in particular for some of the engineering tasks and the dressing of the stones, but much of the work involved in pyramid building was fetch and carry work, as well as the repetitive and labor-intensive work of quarrying rough stone and later moving prepared stones. This is the work of the unskilled laborer. In a 2017 article in the Journal of Ancient Egyptian Architecture, David Mazzone, researcher at the University College of London's Institute of Archaeology, observes, quote, "It is still a challenge for Egyptologists to explain the huge volumes of construction work achieved in pharaonic Egypt, but it is probably safe to assume that the work could only have been achieved under some form of pressure, and that consequently it depended on some levels of coercion and conscription." End quote. So who were these coerced or conscripted unskilled laborers? Now we need to look at the social stratification of labor in ancient Egypt. Understanding unfree labor in ancient Egypt. In the article I cited earlier, Langer provides a very useful list of 6, quote, "categories of unfree or forced labor," end quote, which existed during the late Bronze Age, either throughout or sometime during the Egyptian Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom periods. In addition to chattel slaves and convict labor, Langer includes a type of service called corvée labor, which existed from the Old Kingdom period, when the first pyramids were built, right through to modern era Egypt. We've seen corvée labor referred to previously by academic sources as a form of coerced labor, and we've seen a couple of sources note that drawing a hard distinction between corvée labor and slave labor is quite dependent on subjective decisions about terms and definitions. And we've also seen an academic source say, as recently as 2020, that the scholarly debate over the extent of slave labor used in pyramid construction is as yet unresolved. What does Langer say? Well, having made this list of, quote, "categories of unfree or forced labor," end quote, Langer issues the caution, quote, "It is important to keep in mind that such seemingly sharp distinctions between various forms of unfree labor are at the researcher's discretion," end quote. This is the same kind of caution we've seen before. In fact, generally speaking, we found that the more specialized the scholarly source we read, such as an Egyptologist or a specialist in ancient forms of labor, the more nuanced their commentary is, and the more likely they are to acknowledge that the labor force for the pyramids and other monumental projects included not merely coerced labor, but labor which could be considered a form of slavery. Langer himself writes, quote, "In any case, recalling the concept of different slave systems mentioned above, it is legitimate to assign to late Bronze Age Egypt a set of different slaveries or unfree labor regimes existing in parallel," end quote. So it is clear that Langer is defining all of these 6 different forms of unfree labor as slavery, though different categories of slavery. Langer believes corvée labour, the labour which built the pyramids and other monumental architecture, was a form of slavery. So now let's look closer at the institution of corvée labour. In the ancient world, rulers such as pharaohs often functionally owned their citizens and had the right to arbitrarily coerce them into labour without their consent. This was corvée labour. To understand corvée labour more clearly, let's look at the definition provided by Egyptologist Dr. Ogden Gurley Jr. in his 2015 book chapter, Problems of Authority, Compulsion and Compensation in Ancient Egyptian Labour Practices, which defines corvée labour as, quote, unpaid, unskilled manual labour exacted in lieu of taxation in the form of money or goods, end quote. Gurley's definition is useful not only because it is current, but also because it has been accepted and cited widely in the scholarly literature on this subject. Corvée labour essentially enabled the ruler to treat citizens and foreign residents as labourers owned by the pharaoh. Their compliance was enforced by overseers, guards, and even the army, and the pharaoh ultimately had the right of life and death over disobedient labourers, exercised vicariously through overseers. Certain citizen classes were exempt from corvée labour, but for the vast majority of the civilian population, it was an obligation. So, functionally, rulers such as pharaohs were part of a system which enabled them to treat their kingdom as a private plantation and their citizens and foreign residents as a coerced labour workforce. At this point, the difference between a chattel slave and a corvée labourer, even though it does exist, starts to become a distinction of questionable value, just like the technical difference between the chattel slave and the victim of modern slavery and human trafficking. Egyptologist Antonio Loprieno's article Slavery and Servitude in the UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology, published in 2012, provides further information about corvée labour, writing that in the Old Kingdom period, the era when the first pyramids were built, quote, royal corvée workers undertook coercive labour for a certain period of time, but not for life, end quote. Note that he explicitly identifies corvée labour as coercive labour, though he notes that unlike typical chattel slavery, corvée labour was not for life. In his article Slavery in Pharaonic and Hellenistic Egypt in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History, Loprieno further writes, quote, many forms of coercion to labour and restriction of individual freedom existed throughout Egyptian history, end quote, and also explains that during the Old Kingdom, quote, very large segments of the population were drawn to compulsory work, exemptions being reserved for religious service, while foreign prisoners of war were explicitly enslaved, end quote. As we will see, quite apart from the coercion of the citizen workers who were drafted into corvée labour, these explicitly enslaved foreign prisoners of war were also used to build the pyramids and other monumental architecture during the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom periods, when the pyramids were built. Importantly, Loprieno also states, quote, literary texts present figures of slaves called labourer or servant, end quote. That's quite a statement, since it reveals that some people called labourers, a term we might assume referred to a free citizen, were in fact slaves. This is an acknowledgement of a complication we've seen mentioned by other scholars. The terminology in ancient Egypt is sometimes ambiguous, occasionally due to terms having overlapping semantic domains and lexical ranges. At this point, I'll return to Milo's statement to clarify an important point. Remember, he said specifically that the Great Pyramid, quote, wasn't built with slaves, end quote, and, quote, the Great Pyramid was built by, like, craftsmen and labourers. It was not an enslaved force, end quote. That's a very specific claim and a very narrow claim. Milo didn't say all the pyramids were built with craftsmen and labourers, and he didn't say none of the pyramids were built with an enslaved force. He spoke specifically of the Great Pyramid. Now, he might believe none of the pyramids were built with an enslaved force, but to the best of my knowledge, he hasn't ever said that, so to steelman his argument, I won't hold him to a statement any broader than the one I've quoted here. That might seem like it's making my task easier, but actually it's making it more difficult, since much of the textual information we have about corvée labour in ancient Egypt comes from the Middle Kingdom period, after the Old Kingdom, when other pyramids were built. If the corvée system had changed during this time, we couldn't necessarily be certain that texts from the Middle Kingdom are describing the same corvée labour conditions as those which existed earlier in the Old Kingdom. Additionally, we have the lexical challenge of possible terminology change. Perhaps terms used in the Old Kingdom to describe certain forms of labour changed their meaning by the Middle Kingdom period. We've already seen that ambiguity of labour terminology in ancient Egypt is a challenge. Having said all that, I could also hold Milo to the same standard, insisting that if he wishes to substantiate his claim that the Great Pyramid was not built with slaves, he must confine himself to literary and archaeological evidence from the Old Kingdom period. In particular, the evidence we have for the labourers at Giza who worked on the Great Pyramid. That's a challenge given the relative lack of direct epigraphical and paleological evidence for specific details of the Great Pyramid's workforce. But fortunately, we can avoid all that difficulty since scholarship on this topic is agreed that the corvée and labour systems of the Old Kingdom existed into the Middle Kingdom and treat Middle Kingdom literary sources describing these systems as applicable to the Old Kingdom. There was no significant change of labour systems or terminology, so we can regard Middle Kingdom literary sources on labour as illustrative of labour conditions in the Old Kingdom. So now let's look at those Middle Kingdom sources. In the video description, you'll find a link to a list of all my sources, as well as direct quotations from the primary literary sources I'm citing. But in this video, I'll provide you with scholarly commentary on them, so you know I'm not simply interpreting them myself. I'll start with Papyrus Brooklyn 35-1446, a late Middle Kingdom text. In her article, Ancient Egyptian Slavery, published in the Palgrave Handbook of Global Slavery Throughout History, 2023, Egyptologist and papyrologist Ella Karev, who specializes in ancient labor and slavery, who I cited previously, writes, quote, "In the Middle Kingdom, taxation in the form of labor is attested, as well as punishment for attempting to avoid such labor," end quote. This taxation labor was the corvée, as we've seen previously. Karev explains that Papyrus Brooklyn 35-1446, which I'll subsequently refer to as Brooklyn for convenience, quote, includes a list of Egyptians who attempted to avoid their obligatory labour and as a result are now imprisoned in a building termed the Great Enclosure, end quote. Note her reference to the labour as obligatory, since corvée was compulsory, and the fact that attempting to avoid this obligatory labour was punishable by imprisonment. This certainly looks a lot more like slavery than free or semi-free service. Karev further states that, quote, records from Lahun evidence that in the event that a person neglecting their state duties could not be found, the state could also seize a replacement, usually a family member, and usually determined by sex. That is, a father replaced his son, a mother replaced her daughter, end quote. This is explicitly the kidnapping of a family member for the purpose of forced labour. Karev notes this practice continued even into the New Kingdom, stating, quote, there is evidence that free people were requisitioned along slave labourers for state projects, end quote. The word requisitioned indicates free people being forced into labour, and the phrase slave labourers for state projects is an explicit reference to slavery used for the pharaoh's construction works. She cites the Horemheb decree of the New Kingdom, which specifically prohibited free people being abducted by state officials for construction projects, indicating this was an unsanctioned but common occurrence. We already saw Karev writing of the evidence for forced labour at El Lahun, so we'll look at that now. El Lahun was a Middle Kingdom city where the pyramid of Sensiret II was built. In his 2017 article, The Dark Side of a Modern Community, The Ghetto of El Lahun, in the Journal of Ancient Egyptian Architecture, David Mazzone writes, quote, the town planning and the consequent social order at El Lahun may have imposed a condition of coercion over the population, effectively caging people in ghetto quarters with the intention of centralizing the resources of thousands of individuals, end quote. His article further describes, quote, contextual evidence from El Lahun that seems to indicate that a punitive institution known as a prison, fortress enclosure, or work camp was in existence in the western part of the town, called the Sechem, end quote. This is evidence for a forced labour camp of the same kind described in Brooklyn, where it is called the Great Enclosure. Most relevant to our topic, Mazzone writes, quote, the administrative documents attest to a legally codified system of slavery or servitude at El Lahun, end quote. Previously, I mentioned that although Egyptian labour terminology can be difficult to interpret, and although such terminology could theoretically have changed from the Old to the Middle Kingdoms, we can be certain that certain labour terms used in the Middle Kingdom referred to the same institutions and individuals as in the Old Kingdom. Bazone confirms this, writing specifically of the Egyptian term for the labour camp or great enclosure, saying, quote, "Despite the ambiguities of Egyptian terminology in the documents of the Old and Middle Kingdoms and several alternative interpretations, in the majority of cases, this term refers to conscripted or confined men or women, or similar," end quote. He cites what he refers to as, quote, "one of the best known examples of the use of the word," end quote, in the Westcar Papyrus, written during the Middle Kingdom, which he says describes an individual, quote, "who is clearly considered to be a criminal or confined man," end quote, taken from the prison and used for coerced labour. Bazone provides a translation of the relevant portion of the papyrus, which says, quote, "a criminal who is in prison," end quote, where the word for criminal is the same word used for labourers confined in the Great Enclosure for state labour projects. Bazone also cites the text known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer in Papyrus Leiden 334, which he says describes, quote, "the escape of a number of individuals from a labour camp who were found walking freely in the streets," end quote. The Admonitions of Ipuwer is a text describing the chaos resulting from the breakdown of social institutions, and although the events it described must be interpreted more as literary tropes than historical events, its use of specific terminology is a reliable indicator of what the scribe and the text's audience understood by these words. In this case, it is clear the text is using labourers who were previously confined in the labour camp but are now walking around freely as a sign of social disorder and the disruption of proper institutions, indicating that these labourers should have been confined in the labour camp and were not at liberty to leave. Bazone writes, quote, "Here again, textual evidence conveys the sense of undesirable freedom of movement of individuals outside what should have been a place of incarceration. This episode could only have happened if these individuals had previously been detained in the establishment," end quote. On the basis of this and other evidence, Bazone writes, quote, "It seems likely that the main purpose of the labour camp was to amass and control, on a considerable scale, a workforce of convicts, criminals, and captives, either prisoners of war and or natives," end quote. This makes it clear that the Egyptian state not only intentionally conscripted people for labour in state construction projects without their consent, but also confined them in a building deliberately intended to strip them of their liberty. The fact that this labour camp comprised an undifferentiated mass of what Bazone calls, quote, "convicts, criminals, and captives, either prisoners of war and or natives," end quote, further indicates all of them were coerced labourers imprisoned for non-consensual work. That is a form of slave labour by both ancient and modern definitions. Bazone describes the usefulness of this labour camp, writing, quote, "This restricted the social status of the convicts while making them available as required for cult activities, private household work, quarrying, mining, and large-scale construction works," end quote. The Great Pyramid used slave labour. Now let's synthesize this information and see how it applies to the Great Pyramid labour force. In his 2013 conference paper, Corvée Labour in 3 Times, Professor of Assyriology Piotr Steinkeller writes that the Great Pyramid labourers were not slaves and were in fact, quote, "well treated and amply fed," end quote. Further claiming, quote, "as shown by the great quantities of cattle, sheep, and goat bones that were excavated there, their diet included significant quantities of meat," end quote. However, we now have sufficient information to challenge this description. We've seen that corvée labourers were citizen workers drafted into forced labour without consent. They were not chattel slaves in the ancient world sense, but they were a kind of slave labour in the ancient world sense and would be considered modern slaves in the contemporary sense, labourers under coercion, deprived of liberty, subdued by violence. As I have established previously, modern convict labourers are often regarded as slaves, whether ethically, legally, or both, sometimes even when they are volunteers or paid a wage. Consequently, I think it's inconsistent to describe corvée labourers as something like respected and well-paid workers when they were not even volunteers, but unwillingly forced into work, without freedom, and with similarly pitiful financial recompense, which was hardly enough to keep them alive. Let's review what we know about corvée labour. The corvée was legally compulsory, and avoiding it was a crime. Mazzone cites Brooklyn, which records men being imprisoned because they were avoiding the corvée. Egyptologist Sally L.D. Carteret, who specialized in the ancient Egyptian economy, cites the same papyrus describing the punishment of these workers who attempted to avoid the corvée, writing, quote, "Their abandonment of the responsibilities resulted in indefinite terms of compulsory labor as felons on government-owned lands and the conscription of their family members as well," end quote. That means they were punished with permanent slavery, and their family also became coerced laborers. Corvée workers were typically not skilled or highly paid. They were overwhelmingly unskilled, doing simple manual work under the supervision of overseers. Egyptologist and archaeologist Catherine M. Cooney, who specializes in ancient Egyptian labor, writes, quote, "On the other hand, an unskilled state worker, such as the mover of stone blocks or a water carrier, was given very few freedoms and no luxuries. Unskilled and conscripted labor made up the bulk of the state labor force and had a very low value, with wages that provided a meager subsistence for the workers themselves and perhaps a few family members," end quote. People arguing the corvée laborers were well-respected workers rather than slaves sometimes cite the Deir el-Medina's workers' strike of 1170 BCE during the reign of Ramses III, during which workers refused to work and submitted a letter of complaint to the pharaoh. But these laborers were skilled artisans who were more likely contracted for their work. They were not the average unskilled corvée laborers who were coerced. These laborers had a sense of their value and protested against breach of contract. It is worth reading their complaints, since it demonstrates how even skilled artisans could be mistreated by officials responsible for state building projects. These workers complain they have not been provided with food for 18 days and cite a lack of basic necessities, writing, quote, "There is no clothing, there is no ointment, there is no fish, there are no vegetables," end quote. If this is how skilled artisans were treated, we can be sure the unskilled corvée laborers received much less favorable treatment. We also have clear evidence that corvée labor was extremely dangerous and that a high laborer death rate was considered normal. Egyptologist Tony Wilkinson writes, quote, "Back in the days of Ramses II, gold mining expeditions would routinely lose half of their workforce and half their transport donkeys from thirst. An average workman on state corvée labor had a 1 in 10 chance of dying. Such a loss was considered neither disastrous nor unusual," end quote. One of the greatest dangers of corvée labor was harsh treatment by the overseers, who were at liberty to inflict severe physical punishments. The Nauri decree of Seti I, dated to 1290 BCE, describes punishments for workers which included, quote, "beating with 200 blows," end quote, "cutting off his nose and his ears," end quote, and kidnapping a worker's wife and children, who are then made permanent servants, effectively slaves. A clear indication of how poor conditions were for corvée laborers is the fact that so many of them attempted to escape. Workers deserted in desperation, attempting to free themselves from their plight, and were hunted down when they did so. Cooney writes, quote, "Many desperate people tried to extract themselves from corvée labor and taxation by fleeing to the Sinai or the oases," end quote. If caught, they faced the prospect of permanent corvée labor, eternal servitude. Cooney cites Brooklyn as evidence that, quote, "deserters were often assigned to permanent labor service if they were found," end quote. Now let's return to archaeologist Mark Lehner's 2005 conference paper, Labor and the Pyramids, the Hayt el Ghurab workers' town at Giza, later published as a book chapter in 2015. In this work, Lehner addresses directly the composition of the Old Kingdom pyramid labor force, in particular the labor used for the Great Pyramid of Giza, writing, quote, "Pyramid age texts leave us fairly compelling evidence that central authorities comprised at least some of the pyramid workforce from people captured in campaigns on Egypt's periphery," end quote. This is a source of labor we've seen mentioned only briefly so far, the use of war captives and prisoners of war for state building projects, such as the pyramids. Lehner cautions, quote, "We cannot be certain that the Old Kingdom Egyptians pressed foreign captives into building pyramids. The textual evidence adduced above for captive labor does not make an explicit link," end quote, but nevertheless makes the case strongly on the basis of his examination and synthesis of the textual and physical evidence. Lehner acknowledges his conclusion is inspired by, quote, texts of later periods indicating that Egyptians put captives to work on building projects, end quote, but he also synthesizes Old Kingdom period textual and archaeological evidence to make his case that, quote, both captive and conscripted labor built the pyramids, end quote. Lehner's argument is supported by the 2017 paper of David Mazzone, already cited, which observes, quote, during the Middle Kingdom, a large number of captives, Asiatic, Western Asiatic, Levantine, and Nubian, were taken by force to Egypt, end quote, explaining that many of these captives, quote, were transported to Egypt, organized into gangs, and sent to work in ghetto camps or on estates, end quote. The term ghetto camps is Mazzone's description for densely populated forced labor camps built specifically to house corvée workers and other coerced laborers. Mazzone notes, quote, at El Lahun, the term dependent is frequently used to refer to foreign captives brought to Egypt, primarily as the property of the king, and assigned to temple workshops, granaries, and to the fields, end quote. Mazzone further explains that immigrants in the local area of state construction sites were also conscripted for corvée labor, writing these workers were, quote, subordinate to several officials such as the overseer of prisoners and the overseer of a prison or the overseer of the prison of the Great Doorway, end quote. The terminology used for the staff responsible for these immigrant workers consistently identifies them as coerced, unfree laborers. Mazzone adds, quote, their lives were under the scrutiny of the scribe secretary of the Great Enclosure, who controlled their movement within the special camp, and the prison guard, end quote. So not only were they confined to a labor camp when not on the construction site, their movements within that labor camp were also restricted, and the staff member who organized them was referred to as the prison guard. Mazzone's description of how the Middle Kingdom workforce at El Lahun lived also demonstrates they were not only deprived, but significantly oppressed. He writes, quote, based on the evidence, the living conditions of these confined men and women must have been low due to poverty, cramped quarters, and general overcrowding in the town. While a controlled level of hostility and forced assimilation of social groups into the social system were essential in this setting, at El Lahun there were all the components of a violent society in which social cohesion was achieved by the use of physical force, end quote. Egyptologist and archaeologist Michel Teodoro describes an Old Kingdom worker compound called the Gallery Complex located at the Giza Pyramid Complex worksite, writing, quote, the current idea is that the complex was the living quarter for the gangs employed in the construction of the Pyramid of Menkaure, end quote. This pyramid is one of the 3 Giza pyramids dating to about 70 years after the Great Pyramid, only a generation or so later. Now, 70 years might sound like a long time, but in terms of ancient Egyptian economy and labor institutions, which took many centuries to change, it makes these 2 pyramids virtually contemporary. If the corvée labor system and its associated economic and labor institutions had changed significantly during these 70 years, there would be clear evidence for it, but I haven't found any scholar who believes any such change took place. Instead, as we've seen, scholars typically regard the Middle Kingdom corvée system as representative of a corvée system which existed during the earlier Old Kingdom. And in this case, we're talking about 2 pyramids only 70 years apart, both built during the Old Kingdom period. De Teodoro writes, quote, on the basis of architectural features, Lehner and Tavares, 2010, have suggested that the population of the galleries was highly supervised. Pathways and the street that encircles the enclosure walls of the complex from inside were likely patrolled by sentries, end quote. This indicates the workforce enclosed in the galleries was both a captive population and guarded by soldiers. This is not a free workforce. De Teodoro also cites evidence for the food provided to the laborers, which indicates, quote, the diet of the pyramid builders was in general a low-status diet. This contradicts claims that the workforce was well treated and respected. In contrast, De Teodoro explains a much better diet was eaten by people who lived in the building identified as the North Street Gatehouse, which he describes as, quote, one of the 3 control points of the complex, end quote. In this context, a control point is an area in the labor camp designed specifically to restrict the movement of the inmates and ensure they remain confined. De Teodoro comments, quote, these data reveal that the residents of the North Street Gatehouse consumed better food than the population of the barracks, end quote, concluding that this diet identifies the people living in the North Street Gatehouse as, quote, the guards of the work camp, end quote. So we have a captive labour force whose movement within their labour camp is controlled, provided with a low-class diet, and guarded by soldiers who are provided with much better quality food. These are clearly not well-respected, well-fed, and well-paid skilled artisans hired for their special skills. This is an enslaved workforce. To finish this section, let's look at what we've learned about the corvée labourers used in the Old Kingdom, including on the Giza pyramids. 1. They were citizens, prisoners of war, or foreign captives. 2. They were coerced into labour. 3. They were fed a low-quality diet. 4. They had a precarious life expectancy. 5. They were not at liberty to leave the worksite. 6. They were confined in a labour camp by soldiers, and their movement was restricted within that camp. 7. They were subjected arbitrarily to severe physical punishments. 8. They are identified in written sources as captive and coerced labourers. 9. Refusal to work was punished by imprisonment, permanent slavery, and enslavement of their children. This is why we have seen various Egyptologists identify them as an enslaved workforce. Egyptian nationalism and media distortion. The very rosy view of these labourers has been spun largely by Egyptian archaeologist Dr. Zahi Hawass, who is extremely nationalistic and whose research always seems to make Egyptian history look incredibly modern and advanced. Hawass has been pushing this narrative for a very long time. When interviewed as background for an episode of the US Public Broadcasting Service documentary series Nova, broadcast on the 4th of February 1997, Hawass claimed the pyramid building campaigns were voluntary community projects, which were simply a natural part of Egyptian culture, claiming, quote, it's like today. If you go to any village, you will understand the system of ancient Egyptians. When you build, a dam or you build a big house, people would come to help you. They would work free for you. The households will send food to feed the workmen. And when they build the houses, you will do the same for them, end quote. He even claimed that the pyramids were voluntary gifts from civilians to their beloved pharaoh, making statements such as, quote, building of the pyramid was something that everyone felt to participate, and really it was love, end quote. And, quote, they are not really pushed to do it, end quote. The idea that ordinary citizens just loved their pharaoh so much they spontaneously decided en masse to make some pyramids and other gargantuan monuments to express their appreciation is a little hard to believe given the historical evidence we've already seen. Certainly the claim that, quote, they are not really pushed to do it, end quote, doesn't withstand any scrutiny. Note that Hawass claims are based on circumstantial evidence, with arguments such as, well, if they were buried near the pyramids, they were obviously highly respected and therefore paid well and treated well. But we've already seen that the conditions in which they lived indicated they were not highly respected or paid well or treated well. Those workers buried near the pyramids are unlikely to have been the common labourers and more likely to have been the small percentage of skilled artisans and overseers who worked on the project. Lower level workers are found in small graves dug into the earth, while only officials were buried in tombs. Other arguments Hawass makes are even less well supported by evidence. A 9th of June 2020 article in Egypt Today stated, quote, Hawass further indicated that forced labour can build huge buildings, but they cannot be creative, and building pyramids is creative. Slaves cannot perform this engineering and scientific miracle, end quote. Apparently, pyramids are creative, and slaves, or forced labourers, can't be creative, so obviously the pyramid builders were volunteer skilled craftsmen, not slave labour. You can make of that what you will. I think it's dehumanising and completely disrespectful to the slave labourers who created the magnificent structures which are still rightly considered some of the greatest wonders of the world.